Hello, everyone, and welcome to Heads Up, the weekly webcast and podcast of the National Headache Foundation. I'm Dr. Lindsay Weitzel, migraine strategist, founder of the Facebook group Migraine Nation, and chronic daily migraine survivor. I am here today to talk to you about the Family Medical Leave Act and how it applies to those of us with chronic and debilitating migraine and headache conditions. Many of us with chronic migraine, chronic cluster, or other debilitating headache disorders often will find ourselves in a place where we cannot work, but we don't know what to do because we are afraid of being stigmatized. We don't know if there are accommodations in place to help us, and we often don't know where to turn. Another problem might be that we will find ourselves in a place by the time we are in need of these services or these accommodations where we are so sick or in so much pain that we sort of need to be walked through the process. We don't know where to turn. We need someone to tell us what to do. I am happy to tell you that I'm here today with Tom Dabertin. Hi, Tom. How are you?
Fine. How are you?
Good. So Tom is the Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer of the National Headache Foundation. He also worked for many years as a consultant focusing on issues related to the Family Medical Leave Act. He's going to talk to us today about the Family Medical Leave Act and how it applies to us. Now, I'd like to tell you that I realize that if you are in a situation where you really need this information, you may be in enough pain where you might want to go get a pencil and some paper and take notes. So go do that now. You also will need to know that this is going to be a series. Today, we're going to talk about FMLA. Our next episode, we're going to talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act. And after that, we're going to talk about Social Security disability. So this is going to be a series, and we're going to give you a lot of information that many of you out there may need. So let's delve right in. And Tom, let's begin with an overview of FMLA. What is it and when was it established?
Sure. So the Family Medical Leave Act is actually was federal legislation adopted in 1993 by Congress that basically provides employees with the right, not a benefit, but the right to take time off without a loss of status and without a loss of benefits from their workplace for certain illnesses and certain conditions where maybe it affects them or it affects a family member and they need to take off to provide care.
Okay, I like how you really enunciate the fact that it's a right. Because most of us with migraine, chronic cluster, or other chronic debilitating headache conditions often shut down at this point. We've been through a lot. We're used to receiving pushback related to our condition. We're used to being stigmatized a bit. And often a headache, quote, is not considered a reason to take time off or apply for any sort of accommodation. So I don't want anyone to shut down. Go ahead and keep listening. So let's ask Tom, when it comes to FMLA, what are allowable reasons for taking leave?
Sure. So for example, chronic migraine would be allowable because it's a condition where the employee has received 3 or more treatments in a 12-month period, or has had 3 or more episodes where they need to be off from work. So for a lot of people, and I stressed, as you said before, about the idea of it being a right, when we're employees, we often go to our employers and they tell us that they're going to give us so many days, so many sick days, and so many holidays. And there's a misnomer that somehow family medical leave, FMLA, is actually a benefit, but it isn't. It's a right guaranteed under law, just as you have a right to certain conditions in the workplace that are protected by OSHA. Well, in the case of the Family Medical Leave Act, these are rights that are protected by the Wage and Hour Division of the U.S. Department of Labor for employees to take if they have an illness or a condition that keeps them from being able to work on a regular basis. And of course, chronic headache, such as migraine, would apply.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions related to what you just said. You mentioned that if you had been taking time off previously, would the employee have needed to be clear that they were taking the time off for the condition they wanted the FMLA for? For example, would they have had to say it was for their migraine that they were taking their sick leave for?
So an employee never has to divulge the actual reason why they're taking time off. What they need to do is provide the employer with a certification. It's usually called a WH-380, and it's easily found on the web. They provide that documentation to the employer showing that they have a chronic condition. In fact, the form itself, which was created by the Department of Labor, never actually asks the healthcare provider to specifically note what's wrong with that individual.
Okay.
Our medical history is still confidential under the Family Medical Leave Act. Okay. What we're doing is we're sharing information, telling the employer that conditions exist that have been certified by a healthcare provider that basically cause the employer to have to provide that person with time off.
Okay. So what if there's someone out there listening in our audience who their chronic headache condition exists because perhaps they got a concussion on the job? It's a job-related injury. Are they able to utilize FMLA?
Absolutely. So FMLA applies to job-related injuries, and it applies to injuries that might occur or illnesses that might occur outside the workplace. So in either case, the individual is still afforded that time off.
Great. Thank you. So what if one of our children or another family member is the person with the chronic headache disorder, and we're their primary caregiver, and we need to take time off to take care of them? Can we use FMLA in this situation?
So you can take time off under FMLA to care for a child or for a spouse or for a parent. And there's really no age limitation. When you look at the Family Medical Leave Act, it says a child under age 18 or a child over age 18 who is unable to care for themselves. So you could take time off to care for example, I have children who are in their 20s. I'd be able to take time off under FMLA if I work for a qualified employer. I would be able to take time off to care for those children. Okay.
What is required to begin FMLA? How do we know if we're eligible?
Well, the first issue is to define the employer. So if the employer has 50 or more employees within a 50-mile area, that employer is required to provide FMLA. Or if the employer is a government-related employer, then they have to provide FMLA as well. The next step is to basically seek certification by a healthcare provider who will determine whether you qualify for FMLA. They fill out as I mentioned before, the WH-380. You will then take that to your employer, and your employer can make sure that all the information is there. They do have the right to ask for a second opinion in certain circumstances, but in most cases, the employer is going to issue you the time off.
Okay, so my next question is somewhat related, and it's okay to repeat because some of there's a lot of information in this episode, and I want to make sure everyone gets it all. What do we have to do exactly to apply for FMLA? I believe there's a form. Let's repeat what the form is and where we find it, et cetera.
Sure. So there's a WH-380, which the employee can find online. They can find it with the U.S. Department of Labor. And let me just pull up the exact website. You can go to www.dol.gov/agencies/WHD/FMLA. Now, if you forget that, I know that the webcast will of course note that address, but if you type in WH-380 on any standard search engine, the form will pop up. Okay.
We're going to repeat that again later, and I'll double repeat it later in the webcast and podcast. And just so you know, if you are listening to us as a podcast, we are also a webcast, and you can go to the National Headache Foundation website and find us there under Heads Up Archives if you would like to see the video version, which might be easier for people with phonophobia or people who want to see websites, et cetera, across their screen. My next question is, when you spoke on this topic at Retreat Migraine, I think much of our audience know what Retreat Migraine is. It is a retreat for people with migraine. You mentioned that there's often some confusion surrounding when the employer needs to be notified that someone with a headache condition needs FMLA. So I believe this is important for us because so many of us keep our illness secret. I would say many of the people I know with chronic migraine, chronic cluster have not told their employer because they have the stigma in the workplace. So when does the employer need to be notified of the need for leave with respect to FMLA?
So the law actually says that the employer should be notified as soon as it is practical. And let me delve into this.
That seems very wishy-washy.
It does. Let me explain why that actually exists. So let's just say that someone is driving along on the highway and they're in a horrible auto accident and they are hospitalized and they're unable to speak. Maybe they're even in a coma. They're not going to be able to notify their employer because, of course, there are more daunting tasks and concerns associated with that person's health at that time. So when Congress passed the law, they said that there had to be, it had to be practical to let your employer know. So if you have migraines, if you've been diagnosed as having chronic migraines or cluster headaches or any other chronic headache related illness, my suggestion is that the first thing you do is have a conversation with your healthcare provider, get that certification form, and then go see your employer and tell them that you'd like to request FMLA.
Okay. All right. So if you are, I'm just going to go ahead because I know there's so many out there. If you are someone who's been working for the same employer for 5 years and you've always had chronic migraine, but now you're at the point where you're like, I need time off. This is not working for me, but you've never told your employer. What is your advice to that person?
Well, my advice is that you realize and the employer realize that the clock as it relates to FMLA starts ticking from the time you notify the employer.
Okay.
So you don't have to have the certification prior to taking time off. But at the same time, the employer can't go back and say, well, now that we know that you have chronic migraine, we're going to count the last 6 absences that you had as part of your FMLA allocation either.
Okay. All right. So once we've realized we need FMLA, how much leave is allowable?
So you're given up to 12 weeks per year for a chronic condition. And that is not necessarily in a block situation. So let's go back to the example that I gave of the person in the auto accident. They may need 4 or 6 weeks off. People with chronic migraine may need a day here and may need 2 days next week and 3 days next month. And then it's another day the following month. And so there's a provision under the Family Medical Leave Act that talks about intermittent leave. And intermittent leave can be taken in increments as small as the time clock or the time recording system of the employer allow. Generally, that can be as small as 15 minutes.
Okay. That I find that very interesting, but let's translate that into a scenario that I feel like I often see. People with cluster migraine often have flares a couple times a year, let's say in the spring and fall. So if they find they've reached a level with their disorder where that flare is so bad for 1 month in the spring and 1 month in the fall, or 2 weeks in the spring, 2 weeks in the fall, can they request FMLA at those 2 specific times of year?
Yes, they certainly can. And again, FMLA is designed not only for the person who has active symptoms and active issues, say with migraine, but also recognizing that there's a convalescence involved. When you have certain illnesses, there's a convalescent period that after some of the episodic conditions wane, the person may just need some time off to recover from the stress and from the the symptoms of the illness.
Right. Okay. So what sort of job protection is guaranteed upon return from FMLA?
So first of all, it guarantees that you're going to be restored to the position that you were in prior to the leave. That includes not just the position and the pay, but also your seniority is protected. Your assignment is protected. For example, when I used to consult, I saw individuals who would return to work and the employer would say, well, we're going to return you to the same job, but not to the same schedule. You know, it's a 3-shift operation, and they wanted to move the person from days to nights. That would not be permissible under FMLA. Oh. And most importantly, FMLA also guarantees that the employee is entitled to their health care benefits while they're off on leave. So the employer can't change the cost of the benefits and charge them any more for the employee contribution than they would if the person was at work.
Okay. Let's run through some common misunderstandings related to FMLA. So can we be denied FMLA if we do not apply for it in writing?
In itself, you cannot be denied. Okay. However, the employer has the right to ask for the healthcare certification portion of any application. So many employers will create their own application. And I think that it's always helpful for the employee and employer to have things in writing, but they cannot deny you FMLA simply because you didn't fill out their application. They can deny you if you fail to provide the certification from the healthcare provider, because that's really the form that tells the employer that you are eligible for FMLA. So they can deny you after 14 days if you fail to provide the certification. You could be denied in that case.
Okay. So how about, can we use FMLA for more than one reason? Let's say we have a sick kid in January, and then we have a migraine flare in September. Can we use it for both things?
Well, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, you can use it for multiple purposes. So perhaps you're suffering from migraine, but you also have a child that has certain conditions that requires your attention. And maybe you even have a spouse or a parent that has conditions that you also need to take time off. In fact, I've seen over the years individuals that took FMLA for themselves, their child, their spouse, and their parent. Those are unfortunate circumstances, but the law is very clear. That person is entitled to a maximum of 12 weeks under the law to take time off for those conditions.
Okay. So another misunderstanding is that an employee cannot begin FMLA until FMLA is granted to them. Is that true?
No, that's incorrect. And let's use the example again of the person who's involved in the car accident. They can't apply in advance because they don't know that there's going to be an auto accident.
Right.
And once they've been injured, they probably their first concern is not to fill out forms or get a certification by a healthcare provider. So in many cases, FMLA basically can start when the conditions arise. You simply have to comply with providing the employer with that certification.
Okay. Are there any other common misunderstandings about FMLA related to headache disorders that you feel need to be clarified that while we're chatting about it here?
Yeah, I think the biggest is, once again, that FMLA is a right. It's not a benefit. It's not something that your employer gives you. It's something that the law basically provides for you. And I think a lot of individuals who have migraine don't realize that you're entitled to this benefit. This isn't something that someone decides whether they're going to give it to you or not. There is often a misunderstanding too about whether the employer can require you to use paid time off. They can, as long as they do it on an equitable basis. So they can't say, well, for those of you with migraine, you have to use your vacation days or you have to use your sick days, but someone who has another illness doesn't have to. It has to be done on an equitable basis. And lastly, I think that the biggest misunderstanding is this issue of taking FMLA leave on an intermittent basis. So you don't have to take 12 weeks at one time. Again, you can take half a day here and another day there, and maybe 3 days. And as you said, maybe there's a flare-up period that you just need to be off for those 2 or 3 weeks. And you can do that as long as it doesn't exceed the 12 weeks.
Okay. I think this is extremely important for all of us to understand. I think that we are so busy trying to prove that we can survive and get through the day that we just don't know. It hasn't occurred to a lot of people to look into FMLA. So I think this is really important information. And let's go back and remind everyone, we mentioned the website earlier, but let's say it again. The place you should go to look for information is www.dol.gov/agencies/WHD/FMLA. And what can they Google if they're driving in their car and they're not going to remember that? Remind them what to Google.
Well, I would suggest that for the form, they Google WH380.
Okay.
And let me just caution the audience that make sure you go to a reputable site. So there are plenty of sites on the internet that talk about FMLA, but usually those sites are jaundiced. So I always recommend going to the Wage and Hour Division, which is the website that you just gave, because that's the federal agency that's required to enforce FMLA. And many times, as we all know, there's a lot of information on the internet that's not always most accurate. So again, if you go to Wage and Hour Division, you know that you're going to get the correct information, the correct answers. If you go to a website run by a law firm, for example, it may or may not be accurate information. They may be advocates for patients. They may be advocates for employers. If you go to an employer website, it may not always be the most up-to-date, accurate information as well.
Okay. And everyone just remember, if you are driving in your car, please don't try to write that down. You can always go to the webcast, which is a video version of the podcast. We have over 100 episodes there, and you just have to go to the National Headache Foundation website and go to the Heads Up archives, and you can find this episode and you can see the websites, etc. Is there anything you'd like to add, Tom, to what we've said before we go today? There's been so much information in this particular episode. I hope it's been helpful to everyone.
Well, I just want to state, as Executive Director and CEO of the National Headache Foundation, how proud we are to have you, Lindsay, hosting these podcasts, because these are the kinds of programs that the National Headache Foundation seeks to offer to provide more information to patients and to advocates and to individuals alike. And we're so proud to be able to host these podcasts.
Oh, that is very kind of you. I am very happy to get the information out there, and I hope everyone was able to write it down. Please rewind and watch or listen again if you missed anything. And always in the comments, let us know what you want to hear on the next episode. We are always scanning for those comments. Let us know what you want to hear as our audience. We want to give you what it is you need. And thank you, Tom, for being here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this week's episode of Heads Up. Please join us again next week. Bye-bye.